So how are you going to achieve that score that you need so you can reach your dream of entering university or moving abroad or whatever that may be? So basically, the direction of our talk today is firstly to understand what we are going to be looking at in terms of task, which is really important. You need to have a good idea of what they expect you to do. And we'll give you some tips for success to see what the examiners are trying to get from the scoring system. And then we're going to examine the scoring system in more detail to look at the criteria on the rubrics and the different categories. So this will be kind of like an overview of everything in the exam, and it will give you a step-by-step procedure of how you can go deeper if necessary and reach that score that you need. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is which one is better for you. If you need to go abroad to study, then you definitely need academic. If you want to go to Canada, for example, most universities need a 6.5. Some of them need a 7. If you want to go to the UK, it's quite similar. And different universities have different standards, so you need to check that university itself. IELTS does not know. They only give you the test. That test is valid for 2 years, so you can take the test up to 2 years. Can you see my webcam? It's on. I can see myself. Shows that my video is on. Oh, sorry. There it is. You know, I've never used, I've used Adobe Connect like maybe once or twice, and every time I use it, I make a mistake with it. Yeah, now I'm on, I think, right? Should be able to see me now. Yeah, I can see myself. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So, yeah, most of the time I use Zoom. It's much more simple. Okay, so yeah, if you want to go abroad, you need to contact the university that you want to study with, and you need to ask them, or you need to just go to their website and see what score is needed. But typically it's a 6.5 or a 7. Now, if you're looking to immigrate abroad, then you will need to get a 7 for Canada with an 8 in listening, and perhaps if you have someone as a partner who you're applying with, it might be lower, but that depends. You need to contact the country that you're immigrating to in order to see their standards. So it's a very useful exam. Most people take it for a specific purpose, like university admission or immigration, but you can also use it just to prove your level of English. So if you have an IELTS score in your CV, it gives evidence that you do speak English very well, and potential employers would be happy to employ someone who has a 7 or an 8 in IELTS rather than someone else. So basically, what we're going to look at today is the format of the speaking and the writing in detail. Now, first we're going to examine the writing, because this happens on the same day as the exam. You sit down, you do the reading, listening, and listening, reading, and then writing. Writing is always the last thing you do, which is probably the most challenging aspect, because you're tired, you've just spent a couple hours focusing on listening and reading, and you have exam fatigue. So it means that you've had quite a lot of mental effort. And so one thing that I recommend as a general tip is if you want to prepare for the IELTS, you need to prepare for a marathon, right? You don't just go and run a marathon one day without ever training. So you need to sit down for 3 hours every week and write the full exam exactly like you would on the real test day. So you sit down at 9 a.m. and you write listening, reading, and writing, and then you feel what it's like to do a writing task once you're tired. Then you build up your stamina, your endurance. Most important thing. Think about it like running a marathon. You have to train. So part 1 is either a report or an essay. If you are doing the general one, it's sorry, not an essay, a report or a letter. If you're doing the general one, it is a letter. And part 2 is always an essay. So if you do the general one, it's a slightly different essay from the academic one, and we will examine that in more detail together. But first, let's just look at the requirements for the general one. So a letter sounds pretty easy, right? How hard can it be to write a letter? Well, actually, there's a few tricks. Let's look at a sample task here. This task has a letter of recommendation to the accommodation, a letter to the accommodation officer in a college. So if you're writing to the accommodation officer in a college, should you be writing in a formal way or an informal way? It's something you need to think about. Sometimes you'll be writing to a friend. Sometimes you'll be writing to the president of a club, of a sports club, or the president, maybe the mayor or the town council, or it could be a hotel where you left your belongings or something like that. So one thing that's very important to remember is you always need to think about who is going to read your letter. But you're lucky because they give you a clue. It says at the bottom, begin your letter as follows. Dear Sir or Madame. So given this Dear Sir or Madame, do you think it's a formal or an informal letter? Pretty obvious, right? It's formal. So then how are you going to finish your letter? Thanks a million? That was great. Check you later? No, definitely not. You've got to finish your letter with the same tone. So you have to kind of be consistent. And that's actually what makes it so difficult to do the letter task, is oftentimes exam participants will sit down and they will start extremely formal, and then they'll just get writing and writing, and then in the middle they'll say something informal. For example, don't you want to come, or maybe like, don't you think it's a big problem for us? Don't you think is a little bit informal for someone who is an accommodation officer at a college. Even don't or wouldn't. I wouldn't recommend using any contractions. You could say, would you consider these problems as a major implication, or would you consider these problems as a serious consequence? Something like that. So you need to make sure that when you're covering this letter that all 3 of these points are covered. Describe the situation, explain your problems, and say what kind of accommodation. If you don't, you automatically get a low score in task achievement. I will show you this in a moment when we look at the criteria. So tip number 1, answer the question fully and completely, every bullet point. Tip number 2, make sure you know who the reader is. So these are the top tips here. Always think about your reader. Put yourself in the reader's shoes and think, how would I feel if I was a boss and I received this? Well, this looks a little bit rude. Actually, I might be a bit upset. That is also what we call the register or the style. Keep it the same tone in the way that the reader is expecting it. Then cover all 3 bullet points and explain them, right? Elaborate a little bit. And begin your letter with exactly the phrase that was given. So if they say, Dear Sir or Madame, is it possible to start with Dearest Sir or Madame? Not acceptable. You have to do it exactly like they say at the beginning. Or to whom it may concern. It's also formal. Why can't we use that? Because it's not what they ask you to do. You have to do it exactly as they say it. To whom it may concern and Dear Sir or Madame are very formal, but they're slightly different for given different contexts. So make sure that you always begin it the way that they ask you to do it. So that's the letter. I don't want to get into the letter in too much detail because I think that the essay and the report require a little bit more careful consideration. With the letter, you can kind of try and check and see and notice if there's a mistake or not. But with the report, it's quite a bit more challenging. There are some rules with this report. Now, this is a typical report question. There are many different versions of this. Here is a bar chart. You might also see pie charts. You might see line graphs. You might see diagrams. And you could see like an image depicting a change. For example, how electricity is made is one that I've seen multiple times, or erosion on the edge of a cliff. It's a process, basically. So 4 out of 5 of them are about trends, like this one, bar charts, pie charts, line graphs, etc. But 20% of the tasks are about processes. So that's like the erosion process at the edge of a cliff from the ocean, or about the electricity process, how electricity is being made. And those tasks are kind of scary, actually, because it's a great big picture with a lot of different things. But actually, you just have to describe what's in the picture and they give you all of the technical words. There's not a lot of strategy involved in that. You just need to study language for describing a process. Now, in this task here on the screen, you need to study language for describing trends. Trends specifically, because you see changes. And here, take a moment to look at it. What are the most obvious changes? The female the female part-time education has increased very significantly, you can see, whereas the male is actually just fluctuating. So, a couple of things for this one here. You, first of all, need to make sure at the beginning that you have what, where, and when. So, what? The number of male and female students enrolled in further education in Britain. In further education, and then in Britain is where, right? And then when is between the years of 1970 and 1991, right? So it's quite simple, actually. Basically, you just look at the chart and you summarize what you can see in it. But the next part that's quite important is to include data. You need to have numbers, and I will show you exactly why in a moment. If you don't have numbers, then it doesn't really make sense. So, although the number of full-time students fluctuated between 1,000 and 900, the amount of female students rose steadily from just under 800 to 1,100. You can see that there was a change, but you got to give some exact details as to what that change involved. And that's not enough. You have to describe most of the changes in the chart. You wouldn't describe every single little change, but you would describe the biggest changes. Then the third thing is you need to have an overview, a clear overview of what happened. So I like to think of the overview as, you're passing your boss in the hallway and your boss says, "Tell me, what happened with the number of students in further education?" You say, "Well, boss, while the number of female students and part-time students continued to rise, the amount of full-time male students fluctuated." It's just an executive summary of how things changed. A one-sentence explanation of what actually happened in this chart. And it can come at the beginning or the end, it doesn't matter. The organization is not such a big deal in this one here as it is in the essay. So basically, if we look at the main trends, we have some fluctuation, we have growth and growth, right? So what I would suggest is probably you have one sentence as an introduction. What, where, and when. Then you have one body paragraph explaining perhaps everything that's rising. And then you would have one small body paragraph explaining the change, which is the fluctuation, the one that's not going up, but it's going up and down, right? So you can compare the male and females as well if you want. There's actually a couple of ways to do the task, but in order to successfully achieve this one, you need to make sure that you explain the fact that most of the numbers are increasing while some are not, and you would also compare the fact that the male and the female are nearly the same, while you could also say that the males outnumbered, the male part-time students outnumbered female in 1970s and 80s, but the females took the lead, or they had the higher number in the 1990s. So you can also see that there's a difference there as well, that males were first, then the females came in first in the 1990s. So basically, there are some very important keywords in the task here. Select means choose the most important things. Do not include every detail. If you do, your score will drop very quickly. Report. So it's got to be very formal and very impersonal. Does that mean you should give your opinion? No. No opinions. This is not time for the opinion. The opinion comes in the essay. So, for example, if I say the number of females enrolled in part-time education outnumbered the men because more and more females were deciding to make a career for themselves and take control of their future, no, not acceptable. That's not what a report is. Remember that a report is just the data. That's it. All we want is the data, and we want to compare the data. So we need to make comparisons of this was more than that, that increased significantly more than this, there was a lot more of this than that. Etc. And then always include a clear overview of the to summarize exactly what you wanted to put in it. So let's take a look at this in terms of the criteria. The first thing that you should always think about as the test taker is, did you answer the question? Because this is the easiest one to get penalized with. You can write a perfectly good response with fantastic vocabulary and excellent grammar and very good cohesion and coherence. But then if you didn't answer the question, your score will crash and you will not get more than a 6.5. So you need to break it down into logical parts. When you break it down with the chart, you're basically going to want to draw lines across the chart. Draw a line this way, maybe draw some arrows, right? Spend some time analyzing this chart. You have 20 minutes to write for part 1, but that doesn't mean that you should pick up the pen and just start writing. You should spend 2 or 3 minutes analyzing the data and finding the trend, because writing a lot is not necessarily going to get you a good score. Writing better is more important. So break it down and analyze it carefully. Then, does it make sense? So this is what they call progression. Is there a flow in your ideas? Can we see a movement from one paragraph to the other one? Is it well organized? Do you have paragraphs? You need to use linking words as well. Therefore, furthermore, nevertheless, however, but don't use too many. If you use too many linking words, it sounds fake. It sounds robotic. And then, lexical resource is your vocabulary. The best thing to do for vocabulary is to study collocations. Collocations are groups of words. So in English, we say black coffee, but we don't say plain coffee. We say a fast car, but we don't say a quick car. Things like this. Capitalization is very important, yes, and punctuation. So you need to write the same way that you read. If you read a paragraph and there's a capital letter, then you need to use at the beginning of the sentence, then it means that you also need to use a capital letter at the beginning of your sentences. Spacing is also important. After every period and every comma, there's a space. So it needs to look, if you want to score above a 7, it needs to look exactly the same way that the paragraphs that you read in the reading section look. It needs to be well organized and it needs to be professional. Good writers are good readers. Pay close attention to detail when you're looking at the reading section and look at the models and see what makes a good response and a bad response. Grammar, you need to use a variety of different structures. So, grammar is the most difficult one to prepare for in a short period of time. Grammar is the foundation of the language. You spent many years building up your knowledge of grammar rules. And if your grammar is really bad, you're not going to solve it by taking a test after test and studying for IELTS. You need to study a full program of grammar. You need to make sure that you have long sentences, complex sentences. You need to use linking words to make long sentences. You need to have relative clauses, who, which, that, and you need to have commas. You need to have participle clauses, which is the verb with the ing form, which makes a longer sentence. And you should also know how to use conditionals, if sentences, and passive structures. You should have a variety of different tools, and you should use them as much as possible. Now, if you haven't used English lately, you can refresh your grammar by quickly looking through a book like Grammar in Use, for example, and you can kind of remind yourself of the things that you haven't used lately and then challenge yourself to use them. Then what you can also do is you can get some feedback and get your teacher to mark it, and then you can get the most common mistakes. So you look at the mistakes that you make the most often and you make yourself a list of these mistakes. And after you practice writing, you do a checklist. You check to make sure that every mistake that is one of your common mistakes, for example, if you say he go to the park, you go and check, did I write he go or he work anywhere, right? You check your subject and your verb agreement. Very important. Grammar, you can fix, but you can't learn in a short period of time, but you can certainly fix it quickly. The vocabulary, you can learn some useful phrases in a short period of time. There's a book called Academic Vocabulary in Use, which gives you some useful phrases for essay writing. You can take some of those. With vocabulary, less is more. You want to be able to learn words by heart so that you can use them. So you want to have, for example, 5 really good words that you can call multi-purpose words, words that you can use in every essay or every report. With reports, these would be trends, actually, increased significantly, decreased dramatically, for example, a couple of words like that. In English, we probably have maybe 50 words to describe trends. You probably only need 5 or 6 to be successful, maybe 7. Cohesion and coherence is something that you can work on quite easily as well. And then the task is the easiest one to work on. So when you work on the cohesion and coherence, you also work on the task. If you answered everything in the task, and if you can see connections between your ideas, then you've done well there. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail according to the rubric. One thing that you should be aware of in the rubric here is this part here. Number 5 generally addresses the task. The format may be inappropriate in places. Number 6 addresses the requirements of the task. So what this means is that in the task achievement, if there's one small thing that you didn't answer, 5 automatically. That's why so many people get 6.5s, is because they get stuck with one small thing. Now, with the academic one, it's also possible that you have a mechanical response, which just says everything. This went up by 20%, this one went down by 20%, that one's at 3,500, this one's at 2,500, right? Very boring to read, and the examiner automatically gives you a 5 for that. No clear overview. Remember, I told you the overview was very important. This, without an overview, automatically a 5, because what is a report without an overview? It's not a report. No data, automatically a 5. So no numbers, 5. So there's some of the most common pitfalls. With the letter, the tone may be variable and sometimes inappropriate. That means that it's not formal enough for a formal audience, or it's too formal for an informal audience. It's really difficult to learn this. You have to learn the culture of writing in order to understand what that means. So also here you can see inadequately covers key features or bullet points, right? And number 6, adequately highlights key features. So it's a huge difference between the 5 and the 6 in the task achievement. You miss one small thing and you're automatically dropped down to the 5. It kills you, and it's frustrating. So the priority, number 1 priority of getting ready for all IELTS tasks is to analyze the task and make sure that you know exactly what they want from you. Now, this is also what happens so this one we just talked about is task achievement, right? That's task achievement. But then cohesion and coherence, you can also see that this happens with what they call overall progression. So we have clear overall progression. It means that we have a logical, full piece of writing that makes sense. So there's a report, and in the report there is a beginning, a middle, and an end, same as an essay. But here there may be a lack of overall progression. So again, if one small thing is missing and the report doesn't fully and comprehensively look like a report, you can get a 5 here. So this is the reason why so many good writers, people who use grammar and vocabulary good in their writing get low scores. It's because they probably get maybe, for example, 7 or 8 in grammar and lexis, but then they get 5s in cohesion and coherence. So it's quite punishing, and it can be very damaging if you're not careful. So let's go on a little bit. That was part 1 for writing. That is what a report and a letter looks like. Remember, the most important thing with those tasks is that you are doing it as a letter is supposed to be written or as a report is supposed to be written. So analyze the features of that text very carefully. Next, we're going to look at the essay. So let me show you an example task of a general essay. Take a moment to read it. Now, let me give you an example of an academic essay. Take a moment to read it. So you can see that there's a bit of a difference in the type of task, right? In the general one, we're looking more at a social issue in terms of something that concerns the general population. So everyone pays taxes, or at least they should pay taxes, right? And the tax money is going to these what we call old folk homes, or what we could call retirement homes, a bit more formally. And this is a common issue that affects everyone, from a taxi driver to a professor to a businessman, right? From all levels of society. Everyone is involved in this. So you can think about this actually in a pretty simple way. How does it affect you, and how would it affect people that you know? I would recommend not getting too personal with your examples, but I would also recommend giving details with your examples. Now, when you address this question, think about it in terms of, how does it affect me? How does it affect the ones who I care about, so my family? And how does it affect the country where I live in? Or imagine the country that you would live in, if it's not a common issue in the country that you live in. So how does it affect the community, right? How does it affect, or even the global population? Because sometimes they are somewhat global issues. So when you're brainstorming, no idea is a bad idea. You need to be able to accept any idea that comes up, and thinking about it that way, thinking about how you feel about paying money for retirement homes, and then how it would affect maybe the people around you, and then how it would affect the general society that you live in, is usually the easiest way to generate ideas, because you go from individual to micro to macro, right? So think small and expand from there, and then you will get some ideas. Write them all down on the paper. Now, I'm going to analyze task 2 for the academic one, and I'm going to tell you some rules that also apply for the general one. Basically, the main difference is the task itself. So the task itself, yes, I'm going to come to this in a moment actually. You should include both views in body paragraphs whenever possible. So now let's just look at this task for a moment here. Children who are brought up in families that do not have large amounts of money are better prepared to deal with the problems of adult life than children brought up by wealthy parents. This is actually quite a deep question, and there is no right or wrong answer with this type of question. So here it would be very good actually to look at both sides of the viewpoint. You know, although children who are brought up by wealthy parents have the tools to maybe they have the financial stability, let's say, they have the financial stability to get themselves out of situations. This will not always be a solution in life, because you have to be able to solve problems in a logical and maybe harmonious manner, right? Something like that. So you see how I looked at the opposing viewpoint of wealthy parents, and I turned it around and made it look at the ones who are not terribly wealthy. So you don't have to, one of the biggest mistakes, I think, is writing an essay that is just one paragraph advantages, one paragraph disadvantages, and then my opinion. Because it's kind of like, well, I'm going to be honest with you, that's what we were doing in grade 6 in Canada. It's kind of a little bit basic, and it doesn't show a lot of critical thinking. You should integrate. You should write some of the disadvantages, but if you don't agree, so if you're arguing for advantages, you can write a disadvantage, but then you can say, but this is not a major factor because, and then you prove it wrong later. So your argument should be quite elaborate and detailed. Let's take a look at that, actually. So here is an example of an essay. I'd like you to take a moment and read it and take a guess. So I'm going to give you about a minute to read this page. There's a little bit more on the next page. And then take a guess what you think this essay would receive by writing a number in the chat box. Once you have finished reading, write a number in the chat box of your guess. What do you think this has received from a scale of 1 to 9? So a 1 is actually the lowest score possible. This is not a 1. 9 is the highest score possible. Remember that you want to have something closer to 9. Remember, this is the second half, so there are two parts of this one. First half we have already read. This was part 1. Take a minute to read this sentence. Children of poor parents are prematurely exposed to the problems of adult life, e.g., learning to survive on a low family income and sacrificing luxuries for essential items. Are you sure that's a 6? Definitely not a 6, not a 5, not a 4. It's higher than that, much higher than that. He had an impoverished background, but he used his talent and motivation to set up the world's largest computer organization. Lots of nice vocabulary. Poor families, highly motivated, tend to set high goals, economic and social situation, impoverished background, talent and motivation, do encounter, children from poor backgrounds do encounter. This one was an 8. Why was it an 8? Mostly because the way that they argued their position. Also because of the language that was used. The language was very well used, and it was quite professional. Basically, the position is clear throughout, so we can see that there is a very good development from one paragraph to the next. The ideas are presented, and there's some really good support. The only problem is the second last paragraph, penultimate is second last. There is a bit of overgeneralization, but it's not that bad because he says in some situations. So there's good paragraphing, and there's very sophisticated handling of cohesive devices. Let me show you what that means here. So we have these children, right? So we have children, these children, that's a reference, their parents, these children are taught, many children, and there's a good example is the many children. So there's repetition of children in a good way as a subject. It is okay to repeat if you're using it as a subject. Now, there is e.g. used very well, for example, and then there's a good example is the. So this is an inversion that's used quite well. They're making a direct contribution to their family in terms of labor or income. It's impossible to grade something with language like this below a 7, because look at the type of language, making a direct contribution to their families in terms of labor or income. Now, repetition is acceptable if it's used like this. Their parents, these children, that's the subject. And repetition like this is professionally well done, and you will see it in many different pieces of writing. And you can see here that the first paragraph is a clear topic, which is prematurely exposed to problems. Then the second one, taught the necessary skills for survival. Makes good sense to me. Third one, highly motivated. So there's a very clear logical progression from that. If you think about it, when we go from prematurely exposed to problems, we have a lot of problems early. That means that we are taught necessary skills for survival early, and then that means that we are highly motivated to improve ourselves. And there's a very good example of this of Bill Gates. So it was illustrated very well with the points. Every single thing that this person says, their parents' own struggles serve as an example to them. So you see, this is a conclusion of this body paragraph, prematurely exposed to the problems. For example, learning to survive on a low income, sacrificing luxuries, right? The children's parents, their actual struggles are the same. So they take those into their lives, and therefore they start to learn the skills for development and how to improve themselves. For example, collect pocket money, contribute to the income, selling produce at the market, right? So this one is very well illustrated with examples to support the argument. There are no empty claims. This one here is a little bit. The last paragraph here is an example of what makes. Generally, essays that get 6 have most paragraphs like this one. There's no logic in a paragraph that doesn't have a clear example to consolidate the claim. Children, so many of these children who are robbed of their childhood while working may feel cheated. They often turn to crime. Okay, but why? How? What do you mean by that? Like, it doesn't really seem like a clear and logical example. So they tried to introduce a counter position, and in some extents, there's a higher risk of crime, but it's not clearly expressed in this situation, so therefore, it's, at the very most, an 8. There's just a bit of a lack of an appropriate introduction. So the introduction could be a bit longer. Remember, in the introduction, we need to provide a bit of context. So in the introduction, we should have a bit of a paraphrase of the question. So for example, nowadays the gap between the rich and the poor has been increasing significantly, and children who are brought up by families or children in families with lower amounts of money tend to be better prepared than those who are not. So you should have something a little bit before here in order to set the context. But that's forgivable because the examples are very well illustrated, and there are no errors in a sense. Like, there's no real obvious errors. There's just very good variety of different sentence types. The errors that exist are not errors that cause problems in understanding. So someone who reads this, if a native speaker reads this who's not a teacher, they probably wouldn't notice the errors. Now, yes, one technique for improving your writing is to look at the question, write an answer to the question, and then compare it with the sample. So the best way is to actually cross off the score, maybe get your friend to blank out the score on the sample, put yours and the sample side by side, and then look at them. So, answer the question, the essay, write your essay, take a sample without a score, put them side by side, decide for yourself which one you think is better, your response or the sample response. Try to think about what makes it better. Is it the vocabulary? Is it the answer to the question, the task? Or what exactly makes it better? Then look at the examiner's comments. Then you will see that yours is a little bit better or worse because maybe your examples, you address the task, maybe they're almost the same. That's the best way that you can score, not really score, but get a guess of your score without a teacher. But you really need a teacher to know. But the most important thing when you're doing this is you keep a blind eye on the score until you actually write it. So never look at the sample before you write it. It ruins your entire response because you will be thinking about the examples from that sample. Always write a response fully and then afterwards compare it, because then you have the element of surprise, you can say. So this comes back to the same criteria. Ask yourself these same questions. These are the types of questions you should be asking yourself in the exam. Did I answer the question? Now, breaking down this one is a little bit more difficult because we have several factors involved here. Children in families without large amounts of money, better prepared to deal with problems of adult life, and children who are brought up by wealthy parents. So you kind of have to address all three factors here. And if you don't say anything about the children with wealthy parents, then it's a 5. So as you can see in this one here, there is, it's not actually directly mentioned, but they kind of refer to it in the sense here about how the children of the wealthy parents don't have these advantages. So they, to improve their economic and social situation. This is comparing without directly saying, because we know that children with wealthy parents have better economic and social situations. It doesn't need to be said specifically. They tend to set high goals to improve their economic and social situation, which children of wealthy parents don't do. No, I mean, we kind of already understand, right? So this is actually a very advanced method of arguing a point by not stating the obvious, but stating something that covers the counter argument of wealthy parents. So the cohesion and coherence I told you about in terms of the connection between ideas and the repetition of children and parents is totally acceptable in this example because it creates strength in the argument as we go from their parents' own struggles, these children, and these children, right, their parents, these children, right? So it's referring back to it and it's linking it. Cohesion and coherence is not only however, but, although, nonetheless, therefore. There has to be other connections between the sentences that are referring back to the ideas stated before. Vocabulary, I pointed out a lot of very good vocabulary, and grammar, I already pointed out a lot of very good grammar. So basically, it comes down to the same thing here, where, again, if we don't fully answer the question, we're at the 5 automatically. We need to address all parts of the task in order to do that. Now, here, what we got at the 8 level was a well-developed response with relevant, extended, and supported ideas, especially with the Bill Gates and with the selling produce at the market. Produce is fruits and vegetables, if you don't know, and the parents' problems becoming their own problems. So those were very extended and developed ideas, and they made good sense in this argument. And then all of the sequence was very logical, like I showed you, how it went from the parents, the sequences, whoops, let me just go back to it so I can illustrate it. The sequence meaning that they're prematurely exposed to problems, then they are taught skills for survival, and then they're highly motivated, right? That's a logical sequence. Then, of course, some potential exceptions to the rule. You should always acknowledge potential exceptions. A bit better than this, but I think this person ran out of time. And yeah, then the vocabulary and grammar we already talked about. So basically, the writing process is a 3-step process. And if you look at the task and pick up your pen, I guarantee you, you're not going to score more than a 7. Because when I was in high school, our teachers never accepted any piece of writing from us unless we had a plan. They never scored the plan. They just put a little check mark. That's it. Good. But they just wanted us to plan so that our ideas were logical. Because if you don't plan, then you will write just like you speak. Like this. You'll be wandering down the path, not in a straight line. So you need to spend some quality time analyzing the prompt and brainstorming. Brainstorm means accept every idea as an opportunity. No idea is a wrong idea. But when you start writing, maybe it is a wrong idea. Cross it off, don't use it. But the easiest way to brainstorm is to be totally accepting, because basically we have 2 ways of thinking: creatively, which is expanding, and focused, which is like this, when you're narrowing down. When you're writing, you're focused. When you're brainstorming, you're creative. So you want to keep your ideas expanding as much as possible in the first 2-3 minutes, and then you want to break them down and focus them and sharpen them. Then I would recommend writing as quickly as possible. Most successful students actually write in about 20 minutes. It's a 40-minute time limit that you have, but most of them do it in about 20, maybe 30 minutes. And then they save time for editing. So one thing I can recommend if you're doing the paper-based exam is double space. So write on one line, then leave an empty space, and then write on the next line. Because if you edit and you don't like something, it's a waste of time to erase and write another thing. So instead you just cross it off and you write underneath it or above it. Double spacing saves your time. Now when you're editing, the first thing you should think about is, did I answer the question? Does it make sense? Am I making points that are too overgeneralized? Are my points maybe illogical? So you got to know your common mistakes as well. You got to think about it critically. You got to learn to analyze it. And then you got to know what you commonly do, your common pitfalls, your common errors, and go back and check them. Like I said, when you're practicing, make yourself a checklist. Maybe get your teacher to make a checklist with you of the mistakes that are most common, and then keep it side by side when you're editing so that you're used to going back and looking for those things and checking. So, last thing about writing is you need to kind of establish a habit of writing. Good writers are good readers, but good writers also write quite often. So you should spend time dedicating yourself to writing anything, any time of the day. Keep a little notebook near you. Just write some things down. It doesn't matter. Practice writing things in English. And make it into a habit. Don't criticize yourself. Just write it for the fun, right? Some cultures are very spoken in nature, so most of the stories that they tell are very oral, right? They tell things a lot, and not a lot of writing happens. Actually, writing is kind of like a specialty art, right? And so ask yourself, do I spend more time speaking or writing? I'm not talking about chats on WhatsApp, because that's actually writing like you would speak. But do you actually spend time writing things down? And you probably don't spend as much time as you would think. So allocate yourself maybe 15 minutes per day. Set a reminder on your phone just to establish a good habit of writing. And that will get you feeling regular about the types of, you will feel more comfortable with your writing, basically. When you feel more comfortable, you feel more confident, you write faster, and you write better. I remember when I wrote my first position paper in high school, I got 100% because I was super confident about my writing. So if you feel confident about it, you have a strong position, a strong argument, and you think very critically and you analyze yourself. And you have to also think about how to break down that argument. What kind of examples should we use for the essay? That depends on the essay. So in the academic essay, don't get personal. Avoid I, avoid we as much as possible, and never say you. Never say you. And you should also never use contractions. You should never use informal words, right? So like can't or don't is not academic. And you can refer to people, for example, Bill Gates, or maybe you can even say a famous businessman in my country. You can make up examples. It doesn't matter. They're not going to check it. They don't fact check it, and they're not the CIA, so they don't know about what you're doing right now. So whatever you want to do, just make sure that it's relevant. Most important, a good example is relevant. So, yeah, writing can be frustrating sometimes, but that's just because, you don't have enough practice. Every good writer does something 100 times. Most famous writers have 10 times as much bad writing as they have published writing. So keep it in mind that, writing is always the process of doing it and coming back and doing it again. And the way that writing works is kind of a little bit like weaving, like you're knitting something, right? So it goes in and out and in and out, and the storyline is like a tapestry that you're kind of weaving, right? It's not a direct line like a highway. It kind of weaves in and out. So give yourself the time and effort. Make sure that you do it well. And if you would like to have your IELTS papers scored, you can get in touch with Farhad and he will arrange it for you, because we were working on something like that as a marking service with feedback as well. So that was writing. Writing, remember, it's 60 minutes. One thing I should also warn you about is that they don't tell you to stop after 20 minutes. You have to manage your time wisely. Another one of the biggest mistakes that test takers make is they write a report that takes 25 minutes. Very bad idea. When you get good at it, your report will take you 15 minutes, but 20 minutes maximum. If it's not done at 20 minutes, just finish it and get it out. Always make sure you reach the word count as well. 150 words for part 1, 250 words for part 2. Now we're going to look at speaking. Speaking is at a separate time, on usually a separate day or in the afternoon. So if the exam's from 9 to 12, you might have a speaking session for the same day, or you might have it the next day, for example. Speaking's quite easy, actually, until you get to part 2. So part 1 is just a walk in the park. It's just kind of like, how are you today? Do you like cats? Well, not exactly, but do you have any pets? Do you enjoy the place where you live, right? It's very basic. And it's quite short. The examiner just asks you a few questions because they want to get to know you. And these questions are just kind of about things that you do, right? Music. Do you listen to music? Hobbies. Do you like to, I don't know, cook, photography, things like that, right? And they're very safe. The purpose of part 1 is just to get you feeling comfortable. They just want to make you, relax and start feeling more fluent. So usually one question is about 30 seconds maximum, and they will interrupt you if you're speaking too much. They'll just say, thank you, and then ask you another question. So don't worry about speaking too much, because the examiner's job is to control how much time is dedicated. And they will score you for each section. So they basically, what they do is they write a score for each section, part 1, part 2, part 3, and then you get an average of those as your final score. Usually what happens is they welcome you. They ask for your mark sheet, which is a piece of paper. They ask for your full name, and then they ask you something simple like, are you working or are you studying right now? You could say, well, actually, I'm doing both. I'm an English teacher, but I'm currently trying to get a master's degree, so I'm very busy right now balancing both of these obligations. Something like that. And then after they ask that question, they might also ask you, do you live in the area, or how was your travel? How was your trip here today? Something very basic, very simple. And then they will ask you a few questions like this. They'll say, let's talk about your hometown or village. Or they'll say, let's talk about accommodation, right? Depending on how much or how little you answer, you might hear all 8 questions, or you might only hear 3 or 4 of them. What kind of place is it? You could just say, oh, it's the most immaculately decorated place in the whole world. It's just got all kinds of gorgeous architecture and very wonderful, amazing buildings, and there's so many different people all on the streets, and thank you. What's the most interesting part of your town and village, right? So you see, they will manage your time for you. They will move you on from one to the next. So yes, they do mark you in part 1. They mark you in the whole test. And what you will notice about the way that they ask the questions is they will also give you clues if you're not giving enough information. So they will kind of say, why, right? Because they want you to say more. Or they might look at you like this, or they might even do something like this, right? Kind of like gesturing, give me a little bit more, right? They're allowed to hint to you and support you to a limited extent. They won't tell you any words, if you ask them for the translation of a word, they won't respond. And they definitely don't accept any kind of anything, right? So they're very straightforward people, and actually they're quite nice, especially, because they want to see you do well. It's actually, an examiner feels bad when a student is really nervous and not performing well. It makes them nervous, and everyone gets nervous, and then we're all kind of sitting there and like, right? So they want to kind of make you feel safe. So the examiner is your friend. Remember that. So once you do part 1, then you move on to part 2. And part 2 is a monologue. And it's quite long. You have to speak for 2 minutes uninterrupted. But they give you 1 minute to prepare, so you have some time to think. You need to give some clear examples to illustrate your point. So you got to have some good details. And the best way to do this is to tell a story. Actually, the easiest way to complete part 2 is to actually think about it like you're telling a story to a friend in a coffee shop. not like you're giving a long monologue in front of an IELTS examiner that your entire future depends on, because that's scary, right? So imagine yourself just chatting with your friend, and you should set a context, right? So what's happening in the story? Where were you? What was the situation? You should show the complication or the problem. What makes it, a story, right? And then the change, like how you felt afterwards. So let's look at an example together here. Describe something you own which is very important to you. You should say where you got it from, how long you have had it, and what you use it for, and explain why it is important to you. So the examiner gives you the card, and the examiner says, you have 1 minute to prepare, and you can make some notes to help you if you wish. So basically, the most important thing to do in this 1 minute is to brainstorm vocabulary, right? So the first thing that you think about is always the best thing. Never doubt. That's the most important thing. Never second guess yourself and think, maybe it's that pen that my great uncle gave me, or no, wait, actually, I don't know. Might be that phone that my mother gave me for my birthday, right? What did you think about first? The pen. So just talk about the pen. We have 1 minute, right? You can make up some more details about it, right? So you could kind of extend it a little bit, and you could maybe tell a white lie a little bit. I mean, you don't have to lie directly, but you can just kind of extend the story, like, tell a story that's much more interesting, just because, it gives you more things to talk about. So, for example, let's take the pen from my great uncle. I've just made this up on the spot. Could say, well, I'm not going to start with where I got it from. I'm going to start by telling a bit of context in the story. So I'm going to say, I'd like to talk a little bit about a pen that my great uncle gave me a very long time ago. My great uncle is actually very dear to my heart because although I didn't get to see him very often, every time that I visited his house, I felt like I was in another house, in my second home. I felt like it was somewhere that I had actually really settled in and left just as a holiday home, perhaps. And he would always greet me with the warmest expression, and I particularly remember the day when I arrived at his house and he had something behind his back and he was kind of smiling a little bit at the edge of his lips. And I could tell that he was up to something strange, and I thought, wow, it's got to be something pretty amazing that he's going to show me here. And so he came to the door and he threw open his arms and he said, "Surprise!" and he gave me a pen. It was not just a normal pen, no, it was a pen that I haven't seen anything like in my life. It was a fountain pen, and it had etched on the side his initials, and it was very, very delicate, and it shined in the light whenever I turned it. And I've had it ever since he gave it to me, and I probably intend to have it for much longer than that. I think I'll give it to my own children one day or something like that, because I think that it has significance. It's kind of like a family heirloom, because it reminds me of him, and even though he's passed away a long time ago, I still use it, maybe just for, I don't know, writing notes in my diary or writing checklists or things like that, but it still has great significance for me. And that's why I see it as still important for me today. I wasn't timing myself, but I think maybe I was close to 2 minutes. If I went over 2 minutes, the examiner would just say, "Thank you. Is it valuable in terms of money?" And then I would respond, "Well, it could be, but that doesn't matter to me because I see it as something that's priceless, and I don't think I would ever sell it, so I couldn't answer that honestly." And you see, I didn't actually answer the question because I don't know, but I responded to the question. So you don't need to answer the question, you need to respond to the question. Responding to the question is most important here. So that's part 2. Usually it takes 3 or 4 minutes. It's 1 minute to prepare, 2 minutes to speak, and then maybe about 10-15 seconds for a question, and the examiner usually takes about 30 seconds to give you the card. Now, let's look at part 3. Part 3 is not a monologue. That's actually a mistake. Sorry. It's a discussion. And You should actually try to answer all the bullet points, but it's an examiner's secret. They don't tell you, but if you don't answer all the bullet points, it's not a fail. So don't cry if you don't answer all of them, because it's kind of, actually, if you look at the recommendation, it says you should say, not you must say. So if it says you should, it's kind of suggested that you say it, but it doesn't say that you must say it. So it's a very good question. I recommend, what I suggest for this one is, like I said, set a clear context. Don't look at the bullet points until you need ideas. So just talk as much as you can. And then when you're running low on ideas, pull up the card and look at it and go, oh yeah, I've had it for quite a long time actually, because one of the biggest mistakes that students make with this part is that they read like a robot. They say, the most important thing for me is my great uncle's pen, and I got it from my great uncle, and I've had it for, oh, I don't know, a very long time, maybe 10 or 20 years, and I use it for writing in my diary. Well, that's exaggerated, but you know, I've seen students finish this in 30, 45 seconds and then look at me and get really nervous and go, I'm supposed to keep speaking, aren't I? So think about it like a story. Well, if you don't have enough information about the topic, do it like I did. I don't have a great uncle who gave me a pen, but I just created a fantastic story. Did you believe it? Doesn't matter. It was a nice story, right? Tell a story. I mean, that's the whole point. It's just speaking. They're not judging you on your ideas. They're judging you on your fluency, your vocabulary. So they just care about how well you can answer the question in terms of language, not in terms of ideas. So part 3, like I said, sorry, this is a mistake. It's not a monologue, it's a discussion. Part 3 is a two-way discussion. And the two-way discussion is actually quite philosophical in nature, challenging. It's actually trying to push you to kind of, you know, get yourself out of your comfort zone in terms of your ideas. So what I recommend for part 3 is giving it all that you've got, right? Don't hold anything back. Don't be afraid of being judged for your ideas. So there's no such thing as, you know, a bad idea, but there's just an idea that was expressed badly, which means that you weren't fluent or you didn't use good vocabulary. So what kind of things give status to people in your country? Then they will ask you more questions. And these are just examples, actually. So what I want to do is I want to show you a response. I have a video of a sample response to part 3. So instead of explaining to you how this discussion happens, I'm just going to show you the discussion itself. And I want you to think, while you're watching this, what kind of score do you think this person gets? So just an approximate score, and I'll give you a clue. It's definitely more than 6. Okay?
We've been talking about a well-known person you like or admire, and I'd like to discuss with you one or two more general questions related to this. Let's consider, first of all, famous people in your country. So in Singapore, what sorts of people become famous?
Mainly politicians, prominent businessmen, and a growing number of television celebrities.
Any film celebrities?
There are not too many film celebrities because the film industry in Singapore is still growing. There is a producer who has been involved in the production of quite a few comedies. His name is Jack Neo, and he's quite famous in Singapore.
Now, what about in the past? Would you say that the kinds of people famous in the past are different?
I think there is a growing number of television celebrities, mainly because the television industry has sort of matured in Singapore. But other than that, I think it's pretty much the same.
And what about in the future? Can you make any predictions on who might be famous in the future?
I think successful young business people would be more famous in the future, mainly because they give the youth of today something to aspire towards, and they basically send out a message that it's not just the older generation that can achieve in terms of business success, but that younger generations can aspire towards that as well.
Now let's talk about celebrity culture. Often famous people are used in advertising. Can you give me some examples of that?
Famous people being used in advertising. I think one example that comes to mind is celebrities being used to promote charitable causes. And I think basically, because celebrities have reached a certain status in society whereby people aspire towards reaching celebrity status, when you have celebrities endorsing a cause, it's basically saying that I am so and so and I approve this, and in that way I think the general population aspire towards that and they feel more comfortable, for example, donating to that cause.
Do you think it might be a bit dangerous having a celebrity endorse a cause if, for example, that celebrity behaves in a manner which the cause does not agree with?
I think it could potentially be harmful. And it's not necessarily for causes. I think it's also for celebrity behaviors, because a lot of the youth of today try to emulate celebrities. They may not be aware of the repercussions of certain acts that they commit.
So what about those negative repercussions? What kind of possible negative effects might happen to youth due to their admiration of famous people?
I think with a lot of the youth of today, especially young females, they may idolize certain celebrities and they become very conscious of their body image, and that may not necessarily be very healthy.
Do you think that affects males equally?
I think it does affect males to a certain extent, but not on the same level that it would affect females, because I think a lot of young females are more conscious of their body image than a lot of young males are.
What kind of negative effects would boys have?
I think for example, with the young female population, I think a lot of them would be susceptible to maybe things like anorexia and bulimia, whereas with boys, it's not so prevalent, but it could still happen.
How about influencing public opinion? How might famous people be used to influence public opinion?
I think they could be used to affect public opinion positively. For example, you've got Bono, who is all for HIV and AIDS awareness. I think he's done something very positive for AIDS awareness on a global level.
Can you think of any negative ways they might influence public opinion?
I can't think of any negative ways at this point.
Write a number in the chat box. Remember that 9 is the maximum score and that it's not below 6. So write a number in the chat box. What do you think his score was? So this was actually an 8.5. This was quite impressive because of the language that he was using. There were some hesitations. He paused a little bit, but it was content related. So it was something that was not related to language. It was because he was thinking about the ideas that he was giving out. He seemed a bit nervous, and that's actually, you're not going to be scored if you're nervous or not. You're going to be scored with how you develop your topics. So the examples that he gave were very good, and the way that he used the vocabulary was very impressive, like prominent businessmen emulate a growing number of television celebrities to promote charitable causes, endorsing a cause, negative repercussions, conscious of body images, susceptible to, right? So these are some really good words for you to learn. Susceptible to, and emulate, and repercussions, negative repercussions, prevalent as well. Those 4 terms you could pretty much use in almost every type of response that you're dealing with potential problems. Those are problem type of words. So they're very useful. This is what they call precision in the vocabulary. It's very precise and it's accurate because instead of a prominent businessman, you would use something like a successful businessman, but prominent means successful and well-known. Successful and well-known businessman, right? So it's a word that replaces 2 or 3. Then he had there were really no errors in his speech in terms of grammar, and he had a lot of different structures as well. He even used like thereby promoting and things like that. But also what was impressive about him was his pronunciation, not his accent, because he had an accent, but the way that he used stress. So he said emphatic stress. One example that comes to mind is celebrities, right? So he's putting stress on the words that he wants to make stronger. And then contrastive. It's not necessary for causes. It's also for celebrity behavior. So he's contrasting it's not and also. These are things that are very easy to learn. If you watch TV shows, you hear it all the time. And he had connected speech. Connected speech is like, do you wanna? Did you go? Things like this are acceptable. In fact, they're encouraged. And he was easy to understand. Did he have an accent? Yes. But was it hard to understand because of his accent? No. So accents are not, for pronunciation, no one cares about your accent in terms of the test. They just care about how difficult it is to listen to you. And you may have noticed the way that she organized the discussion. She was asking questions based on his responses. So negative repercussions. She says, regarding the negative repercussions, do you think that? So she kind of builds on it. She also might say, what about film stars? She said at the beginning. So the questions are kind of guidelines, and then the examiner kind of builds upon it. And then it's like a two-way conversation. So to take the coffee shop story one step further, we're having a coffee shop debate or a coffee shop discussion with a close friend, or like something that you might do in a university argument about philosophical or social questions. So basically, the things that you should be aware of here is you got to speak at a regular pace. He didn't speak very quickly, but he had good fluency. So don't try to speak, especially if you speak quickly in your native language. That's a very big drawback, is that you might try to speak too quickly in your second language, and then you'll trip and fall. You can't learn to run before you learn to walk. So what I would recommend is, before each question, take a deep breath. So, well, actually, that's a very interesting question because there are many different ways to look at it. So, first thing, I answered the question without answering it. And I bought myself some time, so I'm not looking at the examiner and saying, And then I am also sending oxygen to my brain, because if you get nervous while you're speaking, the best thing you can do is send oxygen there so that you calm down. And then you'll feel more confident about your ideas and you'll be more willing to provide them. So you got to make sure that your ideas make sense. Oh, somehow my screen share just disappeared. Okay. Yeah, you got to make sure that your ideas make sense, and the best way to do that is to have plenty of oxygen in your brain, right? Now, the best way you can prepare for this, like I said, with the writing, is to develop some vocabulary that you can commonly apply in different situations, like severe repercussions. Collocations are the most important things. Study some collocations, and practice responding to some of these structures. You can also record yourself and compare yourself with some of the model answers. There's lots of them on YouTube, but be careful, because a lot of them are not official. This one came from Cambridge IELTS official from the IELTS official YouTube channel. There's some other ones there as well you can look at. And you can follow this same kind of pattern in answering the questions. Then with the pronunciation, like I said, like I gave the illustration with the one before, you don't have to have good accent, you just have to have good, you have to be able to be understood. Now, he didn't use any idioms, but he still got a very high score. So idioms are not necessary. Idioms can boost your score, but I'm going to be honest with you, it's easier just to learn collocations, because idioms, when a native speaker hears someone use an idiom in the wrong context, it's kind of a little bit embarrassing. So I would avoid using idioms unless you know them very well. And it's easier, it's a better way to focus your energy to learn collocations like severe repercussions, because something like severe repercussions can be used in most of these questions. And it's a pretty powerful word, right? But idioms are just, they're kind of, I mean, they're cultural, and you will see in the scores that IELTS provides you that no one's really using idioms. So it's just kind of a bit of a waste of time to study, in my honest opinion. It's fun though, actually, it is quite amusing. I learn idioms in languages because I find them funny. But I mean, to pass an exam, just study some good collocations, like severe repercussions. So in order to make your speaking count, the best thing you can do is buy yourself some time. Paraphrase the question. So, let me just show you an example with this one here. What kinds of things give status to people in your country? You can go, status. Well, that's interesting. Well, of course, there's some, most people in my country go for cars first, because cars are obviously a symbol of status. So I kind of used some key words from the question. I would recommend even echoing the key word, status. That's a good question, because it puts that word in your brain and it programs your brain to think in that direction. Same thing. Have things changed since my parents' time? My parents' time? I would say a lot of things have changed. Yeah, definitely. I mean, where can I start? There's probably 100 different things, but most importantly, probably technology examples, right? So then the next thing here is, if you run out of ideas, don't just stop and go, you can just paraphrase yourself. You can say, well, what I mean by that is, so let's go back to things have changed since my parent time. One example I can use is technology. And, well, what I mean by that is technology is actually, it's a bit different for certain age groups. So for my parents, it's a lot more shocking for them to get used to it than it is for maybe people my age, right? So I'm just kind of paraphrasing while I think and organize my ideas. This example that we watched, he did a lot of organization of his ideas while he was speaking. You could see he was thinking out loud. He wasn't really searching for language, he was searching for ideas. Then be honestly interested, right? So try to use stress and intonation to show that you're actually interested in the answer. Don't just speak because you have to speak, right? So imagine it's one of the most interesting conversations you've had in your entire life, and at least put some emotional involvement in it. And then, take your time. Don't speak extremely slow, but don't try and speak at 100 kilometers an hour either. It's not about the speed, it's about being comfortable. Quality is more important than speed. So this is what it looks like, the band descriptors. And what we had here was, we were speaking fluently with occasional repetition or self-correction, right? Hesitation is content-related, rarely to search for language. The vocabulary was fantastic, full flexibility and precision. Same as the grammar. There really weren't any errors in grammar, you couldn't really say. And then the pronunciation, there were a couple of small mistakes from his accent in terms of words. I can't remember exactly which word it was, but there were a couple of words that he mispronounced. That's what we call intelligibility. So a couple of words were slightly off, but it wasn't like, what did you say? Right? It was like, yeah, I understand still. So, yeah, basically, what made it so good though is that there was the different types of stress patterns that he used. So he used all kinds of different stress patterns to convey that. Now, if speaking is a challenge for you, then make a habit out of it. Try and do a little bit every day. Try to just add a little bit more and practice a little bit more and build a little bit more on a good habit. There's nothing wrong with, just speaking for the sake of speaking. You can also go online and find language partners. There's plenty of people who want to just speak with each other just for practice. You can form a WhatsApp group and record audios. I do this with some of my exam students. I put them in a group and I ask a question and then I get them to answer each other. And it's just practice for fluency. Then you'll feel more and more confident. You'll feel like you really know what you're saying. Because with speaking, it's all about getting that effort done. And if you struggle with ideas, you just basically have to make sure that you can think on your feet. So that means using things like, well, what I'm trying to say here is, or let me try and put it a different way, or let me express that differently, right? So thinking on your feet is probably the most important thing, and quality practice. So that was speaking. Remember, speaking happens on another day, and this is the time, and the examiner manages the time for you, so you don't need to worry so much. So that's IELTS in a nutshell. If you like an idiom, in a nutshell means to make it brief for you. I put IELTS in a nutshell for you, and I gave you some quick and dirty tips. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm just going to address a previous question. There was one about the general task. Where was this question here? When I started the speaking, it was... For general writings, yeah, what are the don'ts? Okay, so yeah, for general tasks, first thing, most of the things that I said about the academic one apply to the general one. Make sure that you analyze the task and answer it fully and completely. And then also, think about examples, but the thing about examples in general is that they can be a little bit more daily life, simplistic type of examples than the academic one. I think that the biggest don't in the general one is to write like you speak. So probably the biggest mistake that learners make is that they write, maybe one big paragraph, or they write like if you look at it that way, for example, is a common mistake. So trying to just adapt your writing to be more formal, I think, is the best way to do it. So the general one doesn't have to be academic, but in order to be successful, just try and write it as academic as possible. That's probably my biggest tip, because they can't score you down for being academic. They can score you down for not being an essay, right? Where can I get samples of good writing? There are a series of books that Cambridge publish every year, IELTS 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, all the way down to 1. The most recent, I think, is 14, I don't know. In the back of that book, there are samples for each question. And these are the best because they are straight from the horse's mouth, if you want another idiom, which means right from the source. So an essay from one of these Cambridge IELTS books is an example of someone who wrote an essay in the past, sent it into Cambridge, and had it scored. You might even be lucky one day to see your own writing there. I hope not, though. I hope you actually finish the exam before they publish your writing. But those books are the best. And just like I said, blank out the score, compare yours with that model. And
the microphones are activated,
take a guess
and
what the score might be.
participants can ask the questions.
Any other questions? All right. Well, if you want to ask a question. If you want to ask any questions, you can always get in touch with me over social media or something like that. So, thank you very much for coming. It was great to have you here. And sorry about the technical issues. I'm not used to using Adobe Connect, but I guess we got through it in the end here. So, thanks very much, everyone.